says there's 20 seconds left.
You can start whenever you want.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about Kindle delivery costs and trying to clear up some confusion about what can affect your delivery costs, what can make them go up, and what won't make them go up. My name is Brad West. I'm one of the developers of Vellum. Vellum is software for your Mac you can use to format your ebook, paperback. I'm going to be showing examples that I've made with Vellum, but if you're not a Vellum user, you can still watch this whole talk. It's really designed for anyone who's uploading files to Amazon. If you do want to learn more about Vellum, I would encourage you to go to a talk on Thursday. It's going to be given by my colleague, Brad Andelman. He's going to be talking about your Vellum workflow. So ways to get your text into and out of Vellum and some cool new features we have coming up. So that is on Thursday at 8:15 in Bronze 3. So let's talk about delivery costs. And I'm going to start with some things that you probably know. If you've published on Amazon, if you've published through KDP, you probably are familiar with the fact that on KDP you can choose between a 35% or a 70% royalty. And that 70% royalty option has a few restrictions on pricing, and it has a bit of an asterisk that 70% is minus what Amazon calls a delivery fee. Amazon will tell you that delivery fee is 15 cents per megabyte. What you may not know is that 15 cents per megabyte, that's not calculated on the file that you upload. Instead, it is calculated based on what Amazon calls their file size after conversion. And you can really only find this out in one place. That's after you upload your ebook to KDP. You go through all of your metadata and upload your files on that third page where you're setting up pricing. This is where Amazon is going to tell you this key bit of information of file size after conversion and what those delivery costs are. So if you know all this, you may still be wondering a few things. One is, what is this converted file? How is Amazon making this? If that is what they're using to calculate these fees, what is this file? And more importantly, what affects the size of this file? And lastly, something you may be wondering, how does this guy know? So Amazon does not make this information public. They only tell you it's 15 cents per megabyte. I am not an Amazon employee. So I'm going to try to answer all these questions in a few different ways, and I'm going to start with a bit of history. I'm going to go back to the year 2013, 10 years ago, and that is when we first shipped Vellum. Vellum was really kind of the first way you could have pretty advanced styling in an ebook, embed fonts and do drop caps, stuff like that. As excited as some of our first users were, when they got those files and started uploading them to Amazon, they started being very concerned about how big those files were and how that's going to affect delivery costs. So for 10 years, we've been developing Vellum, and also we've been answering this question about delivery fees. So that's 2013, but let's go back further in time to the year 2007. 2007 was a very important year for everyone in this room. That is when Amazon first shipped the Kindle. This beautiful piece of industrial design initially cost $399. It had 250 megabytes of storage, and that's just like a tiny fraction of what the cheapest Kindle you can buy today has. Despite that pretty low capacity, Amazon advertised you could fit 200 books on a Kindle. What people may not remember is this first Kindle did not have Wi-Fi. Instead, it used something Amazon called WhisperNet. And the way that worked is every Kindle was basically like a little cell phone, had a little data plan, and Amazon was using those modems to get books to you. Those books were in a format called Mobi, or if you actually purchased a book, it was in a format called AZW, which was just Mobi with some copy protection on it. So that's 2007. Let's keep going back in the Wayback Machine to the year 2000. And that is when the Mobi format was introduced. All of us probably associate Mobi with Amazon. Amazon did not invent that format. It was actually invented by a company called Mobi Pocket. Mobi Pocket was eventually acquired by Amazon in 2005. And of course, Amazon used that format for their Kindle in 2007. So just look at those dates real quick and compare it. 2000 was when this format was introduced. 2007 was when the Kindle came around. So it was 7 years prior. So what was this Mobi format designed for if the Kindle didn't even exist yet? It was designed for devices like these. Who had a Palm Pilot? Yes. Yeah, the Mobi format is actually based on a format designed for Palm Pilots. So I'm telling you all this just to understand what the world looked like in the year 2000 when this Mobi format came into being. Just another way to understand it, here's what websites looked like in the year 2000. This was Yahoo GeoCities, and this website used exciting new technologies like color. Yeah. So that's just where the web was. Web has a lot in common with ebook technology. So let's just look at a timeline here of all these dates that I talked about. 2000 being when Mobi was introduced. Websites looked like the way they did because it wasn't for another 2 years that something called CSS came around. CSS is how we design web pages and ebooks. 2007 was when the Kindle launched. It wasn't for another 2 years that you could start using fonts in web pages. I'm bringing all this up to just kind of understand what the world looked like and what was possible, when Mobi came around and when the Kindle was launched. And because that's going to help us understand what this converted file is. Right? So this converted file is designed for these old Kindles. The files needed to be small. Why do they need to be small? For two reasons. One is these Kindles had really small capacity, right? And Amazon's marketing team really wanted to say, hey, you can fit 200 of these books on this Kindle. So that meant that the files that came to this Kindle needed to be small. And the other reason is Amazon was picking up the tab for delivery. So even though it had all these Kindles were basically little cell phones, if you purchased a Kindle, you weren't paying for that plan. Amazon was just paying for that, assuming that they would make it up in book sales. So a little diversion as I'm showing you this ancient Kindle on the screen to ask, does any of this make sense today? These devices don't work anymore. These modems that are in these Kindles won't communicate with anything, so they're just bricks now. AZW, which is that format that Amazon was shipping to people when they bought these books, they're not using that format anymore. Ever since enhanced typesetting came around, they've been using a newer format. Of course, most books are delivered via Wi-Fi, right? If you have a Kindle, it's usually connecting to Wi-Fi, or you're on your phone and you're just making use of that. This whole WhisperNet thing doesn't really exist. There's a few Kindles out there that still support it, but it's really a minority. So most of these files aren't being delivered through that system. Of course, it does cost something to have files delivered even through the internet. Amazon happens to be a merchant of selling that feature, and if you wanted to, say, deliver someone a file over the internet, they would charge you 9 cents a gigabyte, which is around a 1600x markup from what they're charging for delivery fees. So does any of this make sense? Not really, but Can we really do anything about it? Also, not really. So let's switch back to things that we can do things about, which is just understanding this file and how we can make sure it's as small as possible. Okay, so back to this converted file. It is designed for these old Kindles. It's not going to have any fonts in it, right? Because fonts didn't even exist when this Kindle, fonts for web didn't exist when these Kindles were introduced. CSS isn't going to be in any of these books. You can kind of tell that from what you can see in this book or on this Kindle, really basic formatting. And of course the files need to be small because Amazon wants to fit as many of those books as possible on these small devices and doesn't want to pay a lot to get them to them. I've said no fonts and no CS. These Kindles did support images, and images can take up a lot of space. So it's in Amazon's interest to make those images as small as possible. Okay, so all of these things are going to be true about this converted file. Okay, so that's a little bit of background and motivation and why this converted file has some of these characteristics. But let's just look at some numbers to help understand what is and what is not going to increase your delivery fees. So as an example, I'm going to take an 80,000 word book and I'm going to make an EPUB file out of it. In this case, I'm going to use Vellum to make an EPUB file. And then I'm going to upload that to KDP and find out what that converted file is, and then I'm going to figure out what that delivery fee is. Okay, so I'm going to be showing a lot of these numbers. You don't bother writing them down. The important thing to understand is just when they go up and when they go down. In this case, you may notice that the converted file, actually the size went up, and I was previously saying it would usually go down. And the reason it went up in this case is the EPUB file I uploaded didn't include a cover. So you can do that either way with KDP. You can include a cover in your EPUB or not. In this case, I didn't, and that made some of the numbers that follow a little bit easier. But since I uploaded that EPUB file separately, I uploaded a cover file separately. When I upload those, KDP is going to combine them together and give me this converted file. Okay, so that's just an example of these three numbers, the size of the EPUB, size of this converted file, and what that delivery fee is. So now let's look at something that will affect your delivery fee, and that's just the length of your book, just how many words are in it. Really, it's how many letters are in that book. So what I'm going to do is upload two books. One is that 80,000 word book I used before, and the other is something that's 160,000 words. And really all I did is I took that first book, copied and pasted it, so it's just the same stuff twice. If I make EPUB files out of both of these, you're going to see that the file size goes up. It's just about twice as big. And if I upload that KDP to KDP, I'm going to see the converted file, size of that converted file also go up. Now, it's not going to be quite double because the cover file is there and that's not being repeated. So it's going to be larger, but not quite twice as large. But still, pretty significant difference. Delivery fee goes up from 6 cents to 10 cents. So what's the take home from this? It's not that you should use a bunch of contractions to make your sentences as short as possible. It's just something to keep in mind if you're, say, taking a bunch of books and building a box set. That's going to be, 3, 5, 6 times larger than a single book, and the delivery fee is going to go up. So something you want to keep in mind when pricing. Usually it works out. Usually for a box set, it's going to be a higher price than in an individual book, so you end up still with more profit. But just something to be aware of, especially if you're doing like a multi-author bundle with maybe has like 10 or 20 books together, that delivery fee can get pretty significant. Okay, so that was length of the book, something that definitely affects your delivery costs. What about fonts? So I'm going to look at two books here. The first here on the left, this is an ebook created with Vellum's default style. And the default style here has an interesting feature in that it's only going to use fonts that are probably on a reader's device. It's not going to use any sort of embedded fonts. This is another style that's offered in Vellum. Now, these fonts here are not going to be on a reader's device. And so to get this to work in an ebook, what you actually have to do is embed all of the fonts that are used by that ebook in that EPUB file. That's going to make for a larger file, but is that going to increase your delivery costs? Well, let's look at it. So I'm going to use two books here. I'm going to upload those to KDP. My first book is that simple style that's on the left. My second book, I've embedded a bunch of fonts. So here is the size of the two EPUB files. First one is much smaller. That second one, having all those font files in there, is going to make that EPUB file significantly larger. However, that's not the important bit for delivery costs. It's all about this converted file, and if I look at that converted file, it is exactly the same. Delivery cost is exactly the same. Those fonts don't matter at all. Okay, CSS, I've said that a few times. It's a language we use to design things. Here's that style again. Just to make things centered, to put the little line under the chapter 1, to make a drop cap. That's all done with a language called CSS. That's also how Vellum makes use of, it's also how Vellum makes the messages in a text conversation. It's going to draw little bubbles around your text to make it look like messages sent from a phone. This is all done with CSS. So does that increase the size of your book? So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to upload two books to Amazon. One is just using my simple style. The other one, I'm going to take a bunch of dialogue in that book and convert it to be text messages instead. So make two EPUB files, and if you look at these numbers, you already know how this is going to go. It really doesn't make any difference. CSS is a really efficient way to express things, and so the converted file is exactly the same. Delivery fee is exactly the same. So things like text messages, as long as they're done with CSS, don't really affect delivery costs. Okay, these examples I've been doing, I've made with Vellum. You may not be using Vellum, so let's look at different programs and see, like, how does that affect things? So I'm going to use a whole array of different programs, Vellum, Atticus, Calibre. I'm going to use Drafted Digital's free converter, Reezy's free tool, and I'm going to take a Word file and just send that to KDP. In this case, just with that same 80,000 word book, here are the EPUB files, the size of the EPUB files generated by each of these programs, all with the same input. You'll notice that there's a lot in a cluster. Reezy's is a little bigger. The reason Reezy's is bigger is their default styling uses a bunch of fonts. So it's embedding all those fonts in there, and that is going to make that EPUB file a bit larger. But as we learned, that doesn't really matter. So what we want to look at is this converted file. There's some slight difference here, but it's not enough to really change the delivery fee. All of these options are going to end up with the same delivery fee. If there's one outlier here, it's the Word file. So the Word file, I didn't have an EPUB file. I just took that Word file and uploaded it to KDP and just had KDP do all of the conversion. And interestingly, that ended up with the largest converted file. In this case, it didn't make a difference, but if it were longer, you could see that that might be large enough that it does increase your delivery fee. So if anything, it's if you're using Word, and especially if you have a long book, you may save a bit by really going to anything but. Okay, images. I have an about the author at the end of my book, and I've decided I want to make it a little bit more interesting and add just a little portrait in the corner. How much is that going to cost me? We'll find that out by doing another comparison. So I'm going to take one version of my book that only has text and one version of my book that has that photo. Adding that photo made that EPUB file larger, even though it's just a single photo, it's pretty small. Images take up space. And more importantly, that converted file also got larger, and that means my delivery fee went up. So just that one little thumbnail there, I'm now spending an extra penny in delivery fees. So here's another example. I'm going to add a few more images. I'm going to take my also by. My also by is usually a bunch of links, and for fun, I want to add a bunch of book covers instead, so readers can see the cover for each of these books. So what I'm going to do is do another test where I add in addition to that portrait I had, I'm going to throw in covers for 3 of the next books in the series. And again, I'm going to test these by uploading to KDP. So here is how the size of that EPUB file grows. Here is how the converted size grows, and the delivery fee basically doubles. So by just adding those 4 small images, I have doubled that delivery fee. So images really make a big difference. It's really the kind of opposite of fonts. Fonts make no difference at all. Any image you add, as long as it's a decent size, it's going to make a big difference. So I compared a few formatting programs before. That was just with text. So I'm going to do that again with a few formatting programs with images. And I'm going to do that same test of that author portrait and the 3 covers. Now here you're going to see a big variation in the size of EPUB files. Some of them being about 10 times as large as others. And the reason for that is these images I just added full resolution images, right? So I wanted to include book covers, so I took my full res book cover that I would have uploaded to KDP and instead used that in the back of my book. And what you're seeing here is a difference between how different programs treat images that are super high resolution. Some of them will resize them so that they're smaller, so Vellum and Drafted Digital will do that, and some will just leave them as they are. So you could end up with an EPUB file that is 14, 15 megabytes. Does Amazon want to deliver a 15 megabyte file to one of these theoretical devices that can barely fit 200? No, so that converted size is going to be much smaller, and you're going to still see some difference here, but not nearly the difference that we saw in those EPUB files. And that's because Amazon is also processing all of these images. And so despite having a 10x difference in some of these EPUB files, very minor, if any, difference in delivery fee. In this case, Vellum has the edge and was 1 cent less, but really your mileage may vary. There's just a lot going on with images as you upload to Amazon, and it could work out differently. The important thing here to understand, again, is just that every image will increase your delivery fee. So I mentioned that these were full resolution covers, but I'm not using them as full resolution. They're more like thumbnails in Vellum, or in my book. So if you're using Vellum, Vellum is going to resize any image so that it makes sense for how you're using it. So if you're using it as a thumbnail, it's going to size it down to a resolution that makes sense for a thumbnail. And you have a little bit of control over how this works. In Vellum, in preferences or settings, there's a control called image sizing, and you can choose between what we call higher quality or smaller size. Higher quality is the default. That matches the guidelines that Amazon publishes for their Great on Kindle program. So by default, we'll make sure that your images are no larger than what's required by that program. But if you want to, you can choose this smaller size option, and that will go a little bit smaller than that. give you an idea of the difference, I'm going to show two examples side by side. This is the absolute worst way to look at a comparison of two images. You're not going to see any difference on the projector. You're going to barely see a difference if you were to come up to my screen. The point is that we do try to keep these so that the difference is not very noticeable. So an option you can consider if you want to use a lot of images in your book. So for that example book I was working with, again with those 4 images, if I change that knob, the EPUB file is going to go from 1.3 megabytes down to 0.9, and that in this case will affect the converted size, and that will affect the delivery fee. So if you have a lot of images, you may want to try that. Again, your mileage may vary. It's going to very much depend on what those images look like in your book.
Was it the left one that was the worst one?
See? Oops, I went back too far. Yeah, so the left one was actually higher quality, and the right one was smaller size. Okay. So let's see. Let's go back to this. Okay, so even with this fine-tuned, I'm still paying an extra 50% to have these images in my book. And so something you may want to consider if delivery fees you're very sensitive to is just making sure you only use images in print. So what you may want to do is, if this is my About the Author, I'll go ahead and use that portrait in my print edition, but in ebook, I'll just keep it text. No image, no extra cost. There are a few ways to do this depending on how you're working. In Vellum, images like this have an include in control. And so in this case, I can just say that this image I only want in my print edition. That will automatically be excluded from my ebook. For my About the Author, for my Also By page, I was using those covers, and that seemed like a good idea to help the reader see those covers, maybe learn about each book, but maybe I'll decide that really only makes sense for print. And in ebook, I'm just going to use links. They can click on that link. When they click on that link, they'll see the cover, they'll see the blurb, they'll also have a way to buy the book. So I'll just use that in my ebook edition, and I'll keep the covers for print. And again, in Vellum, you can do that by making 2 different versions of a page. So in this case, I've made one version of my Also By page that is only used in my paperback, and one version that's only used in my ebook. The paperback will have that longer copy and those covers. The ebook will just have those links. So in some cases, that just may be the best way to avoid higher delivery fees. It's just don't use images that you don't need to have. There are some exceptions to this. Examples like this little ornament that is included as part of the Kindred style, or something like an ornamental break, or if you have an About the Author page, these little profiles that Vellum helps you include in your book. These are all very small images. They're black and white, and Vellum uses a few different optimizations to make sure that they basically count for nothing. So you can go ahead and continue using those. They aren't really going to affect your delivery fees. Okay, so just to review some things, when you're thinking about delivery costs, you're going to want to consider 1, the length of your book, and 2, images in your book. Those are going to be the 2 factors that are going to come into play for the calculation of those delivery fees. What you don't need to worry about, embedded fonts. They're thrown out. They don't count at all. So if you pick a style, no matter what program you're using, that has a lot of fonts, it's not going to affect your delivery fees. Any CSS effects, like the text message feature that I was showing before, it's not going to affect your delivery fees. Text formatting, the specifics of how a program will output your book, it's really not going to make a big difference. Amazon's going to do a bunch of conversion anyway. That's not going to affect the delivery fees. If anything, uploading an EPUB is going to be slightly better than allowing Amazon to convert from Word. No matter how you format, you want to remember that the only way to find out this information is to upload. So you've got to upload to KDP and find this little section that says file size after conversion. That's how you're going to know the delivery cost. Okay, so this talk was inspired by some questions we got earlier this year, and we wrote a post on our blog about some of these issues. Again, whether you use Vellum or not, just what affects delivery fees. So if you know someone that may have this question, you can send them to this blog post. Our help pages are here for Vellum, so if you are using Vellum and you want to know about how to change that quality knob for the size of your images, or how to make an image only be used in your print edition, you can find that on our help pages. And if you aren't using Vellum and you'd like to try it, you can download it here. And that's all I've got. So happy to take any questions you have about this, because there's definitely some confusion. Yeah?
So I'm just curious, because I know that I haven't published books, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Dumb questions, but you talked about 35% versus 70, so it
Yeah.
sounds like there might be some strategy if you write a really long book and you want to put a lot of images in it, to just take the 35% because you might get burned on the
Yeah,
delivery fee.
yeah, there are some cases. I mean, in general, that 70% royalty works out for a lot of people. You know, you've got to hew to their pricing guidelines.
Right.
But yeah, we have seen a few people that they'll maybe like, hey, I'm publishing a book and the images are key, and I can't get rid of them. It's impossible. You know, we've seen books that have like literally hundreds of images in them, and yeah, delivery costs would be crazy. So they'll just opt for that 35% option.
Does Kindle still charge delivery fee if you have the book for free?
Well, let's see, how does that work? Because it's certainly it does not come into play with Kindle Unlimited.
Right.
If you do the whole price matching thing with free, then yeah, they're never going to debit from your account when you make a sale. So it's just subtracted from your royalty. I did mention that Great on Kindle program. That's something that it's never really reached a lot of notoriety, but it's a program they have. It's mainly designed for nonfiction, and it requires that your book be approved for that program. If you're approved, then the royalty rate changes to 50%, but there's no delivery fee. So it's kind of a happy medium between the two, but you're not guaranteed to be in that program. But I think that program is still out there. All right. Any questions from the chat or anything? All right. Okay, well, that's all I've got. So if you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask them. Otherwise, that's all I've got. So thanks a lot.